Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
And I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister. In this episode, we begin with a discussion of some lawsuits that have been brought against the federal government by religious organizations. And then we move into a broader discussion of the Christian response to immigration as well, but also neighbors and those who are maybe culturally other. And then we talk about some remarks made by Vice President J.D. Vance on Augustine's Ordo Amoris, or the Order of Loves. As always, we are a listener-supported ministry and podcast, and if you find value in what we do, if it helps you in any way, please consider supporting us. You can do so by going to www.toltogether.com and just click the donate button. Thanks again.
Today, we're going to attempt to untangle the Gordian knot of federal support of churches and then churches not wanting to necessarily play by all of the federal rules, but then the churches claiming that they have religious freedom to not abide by those rules, all kind of coming out of the idea. I mean, maybe the catchphrase way of saying this is like the Mennonite Church is suing the Trump administration. And this is a complicated thing, and I think you're the perfect person to chat through this with, Cameron, to kind of really get the nuance of what's financial, what's political, what's spiritual, what are the key elements of actual Christian faith when it comes to immigration, and then obviously the broader institutional mechanisms around the world that are speaking into this. So you have the Pope weighing in on this. Um, we'll get into all of that, but
Yep.
let me start with zooming out here a second. And I was just reading this morning, you have Jesus saying to the Pharisees, look, like you take care of the tombs of the prophets, but your forefathers killed them. And you would have been right there with them killing the prophets at the time. You go back and you say, okay, let's talk about would you hide a and I'm going to make some false what I think are false equivalents here, but I want to make it as strong an argument as possible. Say, would Cameron, and everybody listening here, would you have hidden Jews in your house during the Nazi regime and the Holocaust? And we all would like to think that we would, even though that would be illegal. It would be against the dictate of the state, but our religious compulsion would push us to this. You can go back further. Let's use even American history and say, would you have been part of the Underground Railroad? Would you have hidden slaves, which was, massively illegal? They're considered stolen property. And you would come back and say, I have a religious compulsion to the dignity of life. And even if it's illegal, then I'm going to participate in helping this person because they're a human, and my religious beliefs transcend um, federal law at that sense. I think that is the type of equivalent that is being made in many of the categories here, especially as you start seeing a broader legal push in response from Jewish, Catholic, and other Christian organizations or broadly Protestant groups who are now pushing back on the Trump's administration. So basically, fill in the blanks here for people. It was during the Obama era that churches sort of functioned like sanctuary cities a little bit. Like you had amnesty, so where if you got into a church, and there were stories of people living in who are illegal immigrants who are living in churches for an extended period of time, and ICE couldn't get them because it was kind of like being on base when you're playing tag. And so in recent weeks, the Trump administration has taken that out of saying no, schools and churches and other places are within the this jurisdiction of us as a sovereign nation. And I think, Cameron, there was people were apprehended at a church near you. I don't know if it was a
Yeah.
Sunday morning or not, but anyway, that's the backdrop here, and I think we can so quickly, Cameron, jump into like, well, illegal immigration, obviously breaking the law. This is wrong. It's easy, or the sanctity and the sovereignty, and the value of human life. It's easy. And I don't think either of those very quick, this is easy, do justice to this question. And so that's what makes it a perfect thinking out loud episode
Yeah.
is we're going to try to s- walk down the middle of this, not to sit on the fence, but to kind of craft a moral vision for how we should be thinking, feeling, or responding to the situations that we see unfolding around us as it comes to what I think will be increasing elements and issues of tension between the church and the state.
What's fascinating as well is the way this is being framed legally as an infringement on religious rights or a violation of
Mhm.
religious rights, specifically because of the way the invasive nature of these ICE raids. on a Sunday morning in a house of worship, for instance, traditionally a place of sort of sanctuary and a kind of an exemption. And correct me if I'm wrong, Nathan, but the Mennonite Church have also, this is kind of a big deal because they're
Mhm.
saying we're normally committed to peaceable non-resistance, but here our convictions are so strong that we need to make an exception here and fight this at the state level. Can you say a little bit about that too? Because I think that's
Sure.
really important.
Yeah, well, and this is a here's a whole interesting ball of wax to chew on, is that, yeah, you have times in the history of the Anabaptist groups, the 1860 was a big one for the Brethren and Mennonite components of that who had never voted in presidential elections before, because they were very much of the mind, if you vote for a president who leads us into war and people die, you're morally responsible for those deaths. So we don't participate in the system.
Mm,
1860 rolls around and you're on the cusp of a civil war and everything coming unglued. And they're like, maybe this is an opportunity, this is a time where we step in here. So it is a bit of a thing for your more brother Mennonite groups to join in with, dozens of other denominations and organizations who are bringing this lawsuit because they think this is a big issue. The flip side of that I want to say is that Mennonite USA is the official umbrella organization of the Mennonites, but the vast majority of conservative Mennonites are not part of Mennonite USA.
mhm,
And
okay,
so it's kind of like, are you Jewish or are you Jewish? It's like, are you Mennonite or are you Mennonite? And there's
mhm,
Mennonite USA, which is would be seen as the far more progressive, and I
yeah,
think would fit very well within the neo Anabaptist framework that Hunter lays out, but wouldn't match the old school Paleo Anabaptist concepts of separation of church and state. So it, that's we could do a whole podcast on, is
yeah,
a Mennonite or a
okay.
Mennonite, and that's true for any of the Anabaptist uh, elements there. But yes, by and large, they have seen themselves as a peace church that has rejected the unification of the church and the state, and therefore not seen themselves as relying on legal recourse in order to enact their faith. But
Okay. So this is a massively complex issue, as you said, Nathan. So I think it might be helpful to make some remarks along those lines and just introduce some categories that maybe will help us parse this a little bit. So, first of all, let's bring in the historical piece that you started with, because that's really important. So, you mentioned in the Third Reich, would we feel a religious compulsion to hide Jews? And would we do so? Abolitionist movements, in the United States, would we do so at great risk to ourselves and to our families? I think it's always here's where we need to speak carefully. It's presumptuous, I think we would both admit, to immediately say, "Oh, absolutely, that's how I would have acted were I there."
well,
When we
partially
look at
because you it's hard to recognize what's happening in real time.
it's hard to recognize what's happening in real time, absolutely. I mean, that's so much of the difficulty that we're facing right now when we try to make sense of current events, when we try to make sense of, a newly installed president. So right now, the Trump presidency. Some people, for instance, see this as a great beacon of hope. Everything's getting cleaned up, everything's getting sorted out. We are going to recover all of those distinctives that had made this nation great. For others, they see this as the beginning of fascism. They see this as an increasingly
The Fourth Reich,
dangerous time.
yeah.
Yes, the Fourth Reich with somebody who is not only misguided, but dangerously delusional. So, that's just an example of how do we make sense of what's even happening in front of us? So, when we look at what history, good, responsible history, we will have we'll have to paint a more complex picture, and also to recognize how difficult it is if you're in a situation where you are under circumstances where virtue, righteous behavior toward your neighbor will be actively punished. And you're thinking about your own family, you're thinking about your own skin. I mean, that doesn't make what you're doing right, but it's an understandable factor there. So I think taking a realistic view of circumstances and recognizing the need for wisdom and discernment and even understanding where we are in the first place. History
Mhm.
teaches us that quite well. Another area to bring in here is okay, so we are embroiled in a political question because it has to do with not only the laws of our land, the policies of our land, but our common lives. But increasingly today, Nathan, I've mentioned before on the podcast, I think we both have, that when you say, "Oh, well, let's talk about Christianity, let's not talk about, let's just leave politics out of it." But increasingly these days, it's never just politics because for most people, politics kind of have come to really embody all of their most cherished values. Now, that's not a good
Mhm.
thing,
Right.
but that's a political reality of our moment.
Well, let me throw this in here because here's a significant wrinkle, I think, in the narrative. So you could very much frame yourself as, Christian people out there are trying to take care of the least of these Good Samaritan type situation. Great, sure. And I hope that all of us, if we see people in need, will respond accordingly. If I remember years ago out in a different state having lunch with a friend of my dad who was a doctor who helped a lot of people who were illegal immigrants give birth. Not because he was pro illegal immigration, but if you have a 22-year-old with a complex giving birth in a hotel room and you're a doctor,
Hmm,
probably the thing to do in that situation is to step in and save the life, right? So I think there are faithful Christians who are trying to find ways to walk this line. The challenge here is that so you on the individual level, you can say this is the posture, this is what's really happening. On the federal level, they're going to look at something like the fact that the federal government has been giving millions and like the Catholic Charities got 1.4 billion from the federal government. And the number of NGOs that are receiving tens of millions of dollars who are then turning around and using that money in order to facilitate immigration, sometimes illegal. The federal government, I
mhm,
think, has the right to say, we're giving you money and you're using the money that we're giving you to violate the laws of our land.
mhm,
How can you cry persecuted when we're the one funding the work that you're doing? And I think that is a very strong legal, secular, taxpayer statement.
mhm,
It's not a moral issue, it's just a math thing of saying, like, "We can't pay you to act contrary to our interest, and then you act upset about it." And you can find video or audio right now pretty easily of pastors saying, "Well, if the federal government doesn't support the church, how are we gonna do our overseas work?"
mhm.
And a statement like that should raise alarm bells all over the place in the back of the mind of any Christian who I think we should be very clear that what we're choosing to do or not do should not be predicated on whether or not the federal government is funding it. So again, you can say back to Good Samaritan or the government saying, "Why are we paying you to do something that's not in keeping with what the rules of our nation are?" I want to put both of those out there to make sure that
Yes,
we're not making a straw man out of one side of the argument.
that's very helpful. And that has a bearing on the politics of this question as well.
Sure.
Another one would be the gesturing and the the work that is meant to assuage a certain voter base or constituency. So I'm going to draw a comparison that maybe is not completely accurate, but I think it's somewhat helpful. So during the so-called war on drugs, I have a little bit this is somewhat what some of this mass deportation agenda reminds me of. So there was a sense in America that, you have for a time in the 1980s especially, you have rising crime rates. There's a growing sense of real fear among the populace, and so you had Ronald Reagan who said, "We are going to we're gonna crack down on this. There's gonna be a war on drugs. We're gonna put an end to crime." Now, war on drugs should sound a lot, it sounds a lot similar to war on terror. There's no real way to put a conclusion on something like that because terror sort of in a sense never ends. Drug trafficking in a sense never ends. But what ended up happening was it was in some ways, I mean, this was meant to give people the sense that, hey, you're going to be much more safely. So it was widely publicized. There were so many arrests, huge crackdown, but there was a failure to make basic distinctions, and we have part of the legacy of that, and there's a lot more to be said, but part of the legacy of that is a mass incarceration rate. And then, of course, in the United States, we imprison more people than any other nation on the planet. And
I think
many of
El
those,
Salvador is beating us, but
maybe, yeah,
we're
okay,
up
El
there.
Salvador is pulling ahead now. But we incarcerate so many people, and some of these crimes were, I mean, for what we would recognize as probably minor offenses involving, maybe purchase or usage of marijuana, but there was a failure to make some of those basic distinctions. The reason I bring that up here, possibly at the cost of it being a distraction or taking us off course,
We'll
is
see,
that when
we'll
we
see.
we'll see. That remains to be seen. Look, mass deportations, we need to be able to make some meaningful distinctions. We need to be able to recognize the laws of the land, responsible spending. We need to recognize the danger of churches or pastors developing any kind of relationship of dependency upon the federal government. But we also need to recognize a distinction between illegal immigrants who are dangerous criminals, some of whom are dangerous criminals, and people who are refugees or fleeing from, conditions of mass poverty, exploitation, war-torn regions. There are meaningful distinctions to be made, and also while also recognizing, hey, there are limits to what we can do. Do we have the infrastructure to support this kind of an influx? I
So
mean, those
here
are not heartless questions. Those are absolutely crucial questions. But
so I
yeah,
think
Nathan.
here's what I see happening that I'm trying to think of what's the better alternative here because, yeah, so the failure to make distinctions, I agree there. Every once in a while, Cameron, particularly our boys' bedroom gets so out of control that we take everything out of the bedroom and then put back in like what's necessary and then like 40,000 Sunday school projects that were crammed under the bed find a different home. Um, because
Sure.
it's like we can't distinguish we don't even understand what's going on within this room. And so that's like a very knee jerk reaction to a problem that lacks nuance. And it's almost like that's the only tool we have right now in some of these situations is to say, look, okay, some churches messed this up and misused federal money, so we're stopping all of it. Or to say,
Yeah.
some immigrants are refugees, but a bunch of them aren't, and so we're stopping all of it. And so it's that inability to, um, which I I think is the call there is for like how do we reestablish the systems of discernment? That's the fundamental question, not at just the federal level, but at the church
Yeah.
level, at our like what are the systems of
But
discernment that allow us to make these distinctions without because because we don't have the precision instruments legally speaking to do that. And so that's the bleh that I'm sitting
not
with.
only yeah, it's correct. Not only do we not have the legal machinery to do that, there is no place for systems of discernment in our political discourse. Now, a word of hope here. I think there is a growing appetite for it, though, especially among a lot of the younger people I'm talking to. I'm having many vibrant, really helpful conversations with people, younger people. And you know what they want? They want adults in the room to be able to have grown-up conversations where we're not just lobing sound bites at each other and fighting viciously in all or nothing terms, especially where human lives are concerned. So,
Okay,
systems
but I
of
have an idea for
discernment.
this. You know what that's
Yeah, yeah.
called? It's called the
What's
church.
that?
Like that's where that's where this conversation should be happening. I
Mhm.
interrupted. Onward you go.
No, but I no, and I agree, and I think this is why, as Christians, part of what it means for us to model Christian hope, and I've said this repeatedly. I said this not too long ago when you and I were speaking at a conference at Restoration Presbyterian Church right up the street from me. Part of what we have to do is we have to restore a sense of the ability for us to talk to each other. I mean,
Mhm.
we have to talk it out. I mean, other people who say, "I am going to legislate you out of, into oblivion," or "I'm gonna cut your head off," or "We're gonna destroy and annihilate your party," or "Hey, we're gonna give you retribution." But Christians are the ones who say, "Let's talk no, let's talk about this. Let's talk it through."
Mhm.
And if things get really drastic, all right, well, maybe we should put together a council, where we really talk this through. But in other words, you know what a profound gesture of hope that is? It's because you're taking for granted, look, not only am I a person endowed with rational capacities and the ability to discern, but so are others. Other people are persuadable. Persuasion really does work, not manipulating, not knee-jerking, persuadable. And if you back up a second, one of the reasons we can say this with confidence as Christians is because we're Christians.
Mhm.
If you're a Christian, you have been changed. Not just, pick myself up by my own bootstraps. No, you've been rescued and decisively changed. You've been transformed. Human beings are transformable. We're not just persuadable. It's way better than that. We are transformable. Now, can we do that as human beings on our own steam? No. We need the hope of the Holy Spirit, and we need the help of the Holy Spirit to do that. But if you're a Christian, you got that. You got the aid of the Holy Spirit. So all that to say, we need to proceed with great confidence and excitement here. We're here for such a time as this. Talk to people. What if they spit in my face? That's fine. What if they hate me? That's fine. Talk to them anyway. And you never know how far that will go. You never know what seeds will be planted. People are persuadable. Better yet, people are transformable. And the good news is, Nathan, I'm seeing more and more evidence from people outside the fold who love these conversations, want to have them, and don't turn vicious, don't turn angry, maybe on social media, but not when you're face to
Well,
face.
in person, yeah, is different.
Right. Yeah,
Can
very different.
I'd like to tell you a story, Cameron, and see if this and use this as a framing device for how we might think about going forward in this conversation. So back during the Revolutionary War, there was an Anabaptist Brethren family in Pennsylvania, and there was a particularly nasty winter blizzard. And these two British soldiers came to their house. Night blizzard, they're freezing to death, and so the family takes them in, gives them a warm place to sleep, and gives them food.
Mm,
And the next morning says, "Look, you need to turn yourselves in. This is not a good situation. Um, here's what needs to happen. Like you need to surrender. You're behind, your enemy's lines, but you're behind our lines as a country of forming, however you want to call it at that time. Um, you need to turn yourself in. So we fed you, we gave you a warm place to sleep. Now you need to go turn yourself in." Turns out those guys weren't British soldiers. They were spies looking for people who are sympathetic to British soldiers. So then the family gets hauled in. The parents get imprisoned. Obviously, you got the kids and the farm and the blizzard in the winter and some massive financial distress. And it was just a
mm.
brutal situation. And at their trial, when they were brought forward, they said, "Why did you give aid to the British?" And they responded, "We gave them aid not because they were British, but because they were men."
Mm.
And so, and I don't know what I have to go back and reread some of that and look at the outcome of all of that. But I thought that was an interesting distinction, um, where okay, here's somebody who in this case was faking it, but it's a blizzard, it's cold, it's night, no food, and you take them in, you give them a warm spot, you give them food, and then you say, "Look, here are the laws of the land. This is how we're operating. You need to do. We're doing the right thing by taking you in. Now you need to do the right thing by obeying the laws and boundaries of the country in which you are now inhabiting." And I wonder if is that splitting hairs there? Or you can say
No.
we're helping these people not because XYZ category, but because they're human. But
Mhm.
then it's their moral responsibility. Our responsibility is to offer care and guidance. Their responsibility is to live in harmony with the laws of the country they want to be in. Can that work? Or what are the problems
So
there?
so yeah, so the problems are this is where you see in moments of great political or social distress that the kingdom of God belonging to Jesus is going to set you at odds with the world from time to time. And then another set of priorities comes into play. Now, that doesn't mean that you are politically seditious. It doesn't mean, we also have this, we can balance this out with Romans 13, which I think sometime we should do a podcast on Romans
Ooh,
13 because
let's. Yeah.
I think it gets a little taken out of context, which it's understandable. But let me say this. Okay. Let's
Most
bring
of
in
Romans gets taken out of context. So
this is true.
go pick on
This is
13.
oh no, yeah, you're gonna say this to me as
Yeah, you're right.
I'm a Presbyterian. You got all right. Well, let's bring in J.D. Vance here for a second because I think his remarks that have sparked recent controversy regarding the Ordo Amoris fit really well with what you just
Okay.
said. This story. So just to catch up for those of you who are not theology nerds, Ordo amoris translates to the order of loves. This comes from Saint Augustine of Hippo. It gets its most cumbersome and very, very fulsome expression in his On Christian Teaching. But
This is
essentially,
what we have
if
Cameron for, to iron out these wrinkles
that's
with
right.
us.
Here's my job. But no, basically, if you know anything about Augustine, you know that his emphasis on the fact that we are defined not by what we think, but by what we love is huge. And also he has a very helpful look at the order of your loves. So you can have if you the main problem with human life, says Augustine, is disordered loves. So if you have somebody who, for instance, loving your job is a good thing, but if you love your job more than you love your family, you have a disordered love, and that's a problem. Loving your family is a good thing. But if you love your family more than you love God, then you have an idolatrous relationship to your family. That's a bad thing. So disordered loves. Well, J.D. Vance was making an argument that basically you have the order of your loves works like this when it comes to, you love first and foremost, you love your family. You can, they are your priority. And then, other people, your friends, it works in kind of concentric circles. I should be careful here because I'm already using the Pope's language and kind of critiquing what J.D. Vance said. But he basically represents it as a series of concentric circles. You beginning with the people, your family, your own family. You love them the most. Then, your love extends to your friends and immediate community, your neighbor. And then, on outward we go to, way distant out there maybe is the
The
stranger
whales.
or a march. Yes, correct. Yes, yes. Or a migrant. The same thing with nation, you love your nation first and then other nations. So now, to be fair, I'm one of my friends who's a scholar and has done a lot of work on Augustine pointed out, look, we've been debating, scholars have been debating precisely what Augustine means by ordo amoris for years and years and years. So it's not it's not going to be solved right now. Getting into the precise distinctions he's offering here, but certainly when we look at Christ's commands, I don't. Now you have to take this with a grain of salt. This is Cameron McAllister speaking. I don't think that what J.D. Vance says here works. I don't think it holds up. Let me tell you really quickly why. But let me just say what Dallas Willard used to often say. I really want you to mull this over. I am not telling you that this is what you should think. I don't want you to think it just because I said it. I want you to mull this over. It's very important. I want you to pray about this. This is really important stuff. But when we look at what Christ says about love, if we look at the parable of the Good Samaritan, for instance, which Pope Francis, that's the very parable he references in his strongly worded letter regarding mass deportation and the treatment of immigrants right now. But you see a radical form of love that is very risky. And I think the right word here is risky. But also you have to balance it out with other passages that talk about if anybody wants to follow me, you take up your cross, but also nobody who does not hate mother, father, brother, sister, aunt, uncle,
Right.
father-in-law, mother-in-law. I mean, it's
House.
pretty
Yeah.
extensive. It goes, yeah, basically your whole household. And bear in mind, Jesus is saying this to a Middle Eastern audience for whom family ties they occupied a degree of importance that few of us could really wrap our heads around. Okay.
So
So this is a
I'm
statement.
with you.
Yeah. So let's hear.
I don't see an
I want,
ordered hierarchy of love. I think there
no,
might be. Hmm, this is. I'm seriously not trying to increase the confusion here. I think there are orders of responsibility, but not orders of love. Um,
I would
and
agree.
so
Please say more. Yeah.
I do have the responsibility to make sure that my kids have breakfast before I
Yeah.
leave home. Um, and I do love them, but that does not mean that I'm not to be looking out for the needs of others. It's that some of us do have assignments of responsibility that are important parts of that. And I don't see those as mutually
Mutually exclusive.
contradictory yeah, they're not exclusive or in conflict
Yeah.
at all. But the love isn't ordered, but that doesn't mean that we have to be all things to all people in every single circumstance.
Now, there's
So
an element of practical truth to what JD Vance is saying. I wanna say that as well. I mean,
okay, so here
like you said, I mean, you
I think if
can't.
you're the vice president of a country, that's what you're elected to do. So that to me, it makes sense as a political argument, but not as a religious argument.
I like that. It's not it is fundamentally a political argument and not a religious argument, but also, I mean, the truth is, you can't love everybody in the same way because, you have people who are in your immediate circles who's have the mo who with whom you spend the most time, whose lives you impact the most deeply. So there is that, but here's the thing though, Nathan. So, yeah, that would be your family and your immediate community, but occasionally we find ourselves as Christians on a collision course with the cultural other. As
Okay.
in they come knocking on our door, "Please, please shelter me in your house." And so if you just run it through the moral calculus of what J.D. Vance is saying, it's an instant no. No, you're gonna jeopardize my family. My primary obligation is to them, and I love them more than you. Therefore, be on your way. Well, all of us would probably most of us who are, have read of the lives of the saints and great people, even in the recent past, would say, "Ooh, hold on a second. I'm not sure I wanna say that." You see where I'm going there.
So I talked at the beginning about, I think, a false equivalence. And this is where help me think through this. So you look at, I mean, one of the other major players in this lawsuit um, are Jewish communities who have run massive Hebrew immigration efforts for a long time. Originally started during World War II when you had a American Jews trying to get other Jews out of Russia into the United States.
Mhm,
And so I think people would look at that and say, "Hey, that's a legitimate concern at that time." Um, and that organization has continued to this day and now is focused primarily on South America and traffic that direction. So would people say, "Well, that's a different situation. That's a different circumstance." And this is where I don't know that we know enough in every situation to say, is the plight of okay, so for example, um, if somebody comes illegally into the country and then wants shelter from you personally, is them going back to their country the same as them being returned to a concentration camp? Is that the same as a slave going back to their slave master?
mhm,
No, I don't think
yeah,
so. Does that mean that they won't face difficulties if they go back? I don't think that's true either. But that's where I was like, I don't think this is an apples to apples comparison to put it exactly in that terms, particularly since there is a legal way to immigrate into the United States. And so that's the underlying wrinkle here that I hope we get sorted out as a country, as a Christian, and as somebody who's an American, of saying, I mean, I know people, the immigration process is tricky. It takes a
yeah,
long time. There is so much paperwork and back and forth and ambiguity and confusion and appointments. It's nuts. We have a good friend in our church who our church prayed for months trying to get her paperwork sorted out, and we all cheered when she got it because
yeah,
it was an exciting time of her huzzah, you know, you persevered through the system. And it turns out when they do that, they know way more about how the US government works in US history than most Americans do. I mean, taking that knowledge test is no joke. Um, and so there is a good and a right way to do this. And so I don't think we
mhm,
want to set it up as an either or where we're saying as Christians we're anti-immigration and that includes legal and illegal immigration because there is still a way, and I think that's why you see a lot of people who have migrated through the legal system who they themselves are super happy to be here, but also think that other people shouldn't take shortcuts in doing that. So I just wanted to throw that in there before I forgot about it. That the scenario that I set up in the beginning, I don't believe was a true equivalent type of thing.
no, I think that's really helpful, and I think my hope with this episode is just that we've begun to see that how rich and complex of a subject this actually is, and that we will be committed to systems of discernment as we work
Yeah,
our way through it, as we think about it legally, as we think about it personally, as we think about it in our prayer life, and as we think about it in our work, possibly if we work in these fields where we're helping people to immigrate or we're helping refugees, for all of those who are affected in these fields, we hope that this conversation becomes a good deal more rich, and that more discernment is in use, and that we begin to move past just political talking points so that we can
Well,
think about this
let me
more
throw one more
clearly.
let me throw
Yeah.
one more tidbit in here before you bring this to a close. So, we're afraid. We're aware of the word xenophobia, right?
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
xenos is the other, phobia, fear. So fear of the other, and xenophobia is a word that's thrown around frequently, I think, when it comes to anytime you have the movement of populations in relation to each other, and there's the other. So Jesus talks about I was the other. When he talks about being the stranger, that is the word xenos. I was the other, I was the outsider. And you took me in. It's pretty clear language there. I we'll have to get somebody who's a better Greek scholar or a Greek scholar period to look at this, but we were having a Bible study a week or two ago, and I recognized that there's a command in the New Testament that says practice hospitality. And that command to practice hospitality is philoxenoi, which is philos, love, like Philadelphia, philia, love, and then xenos, the other. And so the command to practice hospitality is philioxenos. The opposite of that is xenophobia. And so it's
Mm,
reversed in its order and reversed in its meaning, but the opposite of xenophobia is hospitality, loving the other. And so what I want us to do, I think, what I want myself to do as a Christian, and for the rest of you to contemplate this as you listen, is to recognize that the hospitality and the love of the other is not primarily a political distinction. Our partisan political legal framework has a bearing on it, but it is not foundationally. And I think it's so easy right now for us, Cameron, particularly for more conservative cultural Christians, to start
mhm.
slowly adapting political thought and commentary as if it were religious language. And so let's
Yeah.
just pump the brakes on that. So that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing is that I think suffering is very much on the table for the Christian if they decide to go against the way of
Mhm.
the government or the rules of the laws of the land. If you say I have a different view of the sanctity of life and I'm not going to play by this set of laws and therefore you suffer for it, that seems to me to be the biblical alternative. There was nobody who hid Jews who then was found out and was sent to a concentration camp who didn't see that coming. They knew that that was the consequent of the punishment of disobeying the laws of the land. And so this is where I want us to be careful of like the whole lawsuit thing of like suffering more than so than whining. I think if you're going to stick your hand up and say we're not going to abide by the laws, then you need to be willing to suffer for it. And just because you suffer doesn't mean you're wrong. It's just I don't think you can have your cake and eat it too. And this is one spot where I think that tension is going to come into play here. Um, whether that means, I mean, you even had what is Beto O'Rourke was talking about taking away um, the tax exempt status of churches and religious organizations who didn't want to, follow like that was a couple elections ago. But that idea is out there. So what does the church look like when it loses its tax status? What does your mission policy look like when it loses its federal funding? What does your lifestyle look like when you lose your XYZ support of the federal government? Can you as a Christian be part of a community that has a robust enough theology and a clear enough idea of what Christ is calling you to and has the mechanisms of discernment in order to live well in those times? And universally across the history of the world, there are Christians who have fallen flat on their faces in those moments, and there are those who have stood up, worshiped the Lord in spirit and truth, and lived well for the glory of God and the good of their neighbor and for the good of those who are just passing by. And so that's the complexity. I think we've chewed this ball of wax. I don't think we're at the spot where you could swallow it, but set that out there for your consideration.
And much more can be said, and I'm sure we will when it comes when it comes down to it. But thank you for listening. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.